Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? Very good, amazing. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much to Douglas and Anika for having me here today. I'm so excited to be here. As you can tell by my accent, I'm not from around here either. I am from the United Kingdom, and as Douglas said earlier, I'm from a think tank very, very similar to the Mississippi Centre for Public Policy, called the Institute of Economic Affairs. We are based in London, and we do very, very similar stuff to what these guys here do as well. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about the morality of capitalism. You already heard a little bit from Douglas earlier about what the kind of free market looks like that we're describing. Now, I often hear this term capitalism. Hands up, who's heard of the term capitalism? Amazing. Who could tell me what they think it might mean? Yes?
I think it's free trade. You can buy and sell without the government kind of stepping in.
Yes, yes. So effectively what we're talking about is free trade. But that isn't necessarily the type of capitalism that you end up hearing about online or on from many different perspectives that you hear people talk about when they talk about capitalism. Capital, technically, could also, capitalism itself could also be socialism, right? It could be this idea that actually capital, if you've got capital, so things like land or physical machinery, that could occur in a socialist economy. So what we mean by capitalism, what I'm describing as capitalism, is exactly what you said. It's the free market. It's the free exchange of goods and services. Now, we hear a lot of criticisms of capitalism. We hear people say that capitalism is terrible, it's evil, it's disgraceful, and we can tackle those particular criticisms head on in a matter of a couple of minutes. So the first one is exploitation. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Does anybody know where that quote might be from, or who might have said it? Maybe. It's a very, very famous socialist thinker. Anybody have an idea? Maybe. Guess. Yeah.
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx. Yes, well done. Yeah, so that quote is from Karl Marx. Selfishness. Capitalism makes everybody selfish. The bourgeoisie has pitilessly torn asunder the motley of ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, that callous cash payment. It makes us very selfish and very, very mean, and instability. It appears then that capitalist production comprises conditions independent of good or bad will, conditions which permit working class to enjoy the relative prosperity only momentarily, and that is always only a harbinger of a coming crisis. So capitalism creates all of these different crises. It means that we have all of this different amounts of instability. Now, I can tackle these particular criticisms head on. We can say that, okay, the first one, capitalism causes exploitation. It might be one of the most, I think, pernicious misunderstandings of capitalism. The idea that absent market capitalism would create greater abundance of wealth, I think, is one of the most pernicious misunderstandings of capitalism. If any of us look across the world and see exactly what there is and exactly what kind of systems produce wealth and produce better outcomes, and the systems that produce worse outcomes, it is abundantly clear that not only does the free market, does the free exchange of goods and services result in better working conditions, better pay, and more abundant lifestyles. It is abundantly clear when you look across the world as well. So despite all of this mounting evidence, there are all of these general criticisms around the development of capitalism. Now, we've got to be very clear about the consequences here. All developed countries have a market-based economy. All developed countries in the world, all countries that have been able to develop past what we saw pre-industrial revolution, have had some form of a market economy. And this also kind of goes to your earlier question with Douglas about exploitation. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, both of them, created these kind of quite pernicious arguments against what would be what we might consider a free market or free exchange. But of course, back then it looked slightly different. And I think we've got to have these conversations about that kind of full frontal assault on capitalism. And many intellectuals, many entertainers, many academics will criticise it based on this idea of exploitation. But as I said, all developed countries have some form of market economy. And if we look at countries like Venezuela or North Korea, or indeed the Soviet Union before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's very clear to say. Now, what's more dangerous is the idea that actually the solution, not only is capitalism exploitative, but what we need to have instead is a kind of huge, unprecedented intervention into the economy by the state. And that's what socialism is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And that kind of quite dangerous perspective effectively means that a lot of those particular people are arguing for what we might term communism. Who's heard of communism? Who can define communism for me? We'll try and have a guess at what they might think communism is. Yeah, go on.
You're like sharing everything, like everyone's on a level playing field.
Yeah, okay, so everybody's on a level playing field, everybody's equal, equality. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, communism is like when the state takes everything and gives it to people based on what they think the people needs and not what the people think they need.
Absolutely, yeah. So this idea that actually the state has control over the means of production. Now, that is where we end up with particularly dangerous arguments for economic systems like communism. Again, I'm talking about the consequences here. We've seen this happen countlessly across the world. We know that the estimates around the deaths and the famines as a result of these kind of economic systems, where the price mechanism is completely abolished and the state has complete control over the means of production, over creating things. I mean, people, some of the higher estimates are in the 110 millions across the Soviet Union. We saw the kind of poverty, and we know that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, nobody fled from West Germany to East Germany. Loads of people left from East Germany to West Germany towards a more successful and wealthier, more abundant economy. The second argument, that capitalism causes people to be selfish. Selfishness, this idea that actually it's a system that rewards self-interest. Now, there's an economist called Deirdre McCloskey who noted that people at all times across the world have attempted to amass capital, so things like land, resources, money, but those collective attempts across history did not result in the development that we saw in the 1800s, in the Industrial Revolution. None of those attempts have resulted in that, except for the fact that when people have decided to exchange freely, which is what Douglas spoke about earlier, that's what resulted in the unprecedented effect on wealth, on people's standard of living. And as a result of that, we saw millions of people across the world live in much better circumstances than they otherwise had been. And we saw that across different parameters. If you look at child mortality rates, back in the day, people had to have about 15 children, and most of them would die in order to have a couple that survived. Nowadays, most of the time, your children do survive because we have better medicine and better technology. We see these advancements occur in the free market, and I'm going to talk a bit about entrepreneurship in this talk as well. So, the underlying foundation of capitalism is human freedom. It's the freedom to exchange, and it's when people are allowed to pursue their self-interest, so I would use the term self-interest rather than selfish, when people are allowed to pursue their self-interest and exchange freely, that is when we see the betterment of society. So these two are terrible arguments. The third one, instability. This idea that actually governments create, that capitalism creates instability, that we see the 2008 financial crash, we saw the Great Depression, we see huge sort of waves in the way in which the economy works and GDP fluctuating. But again, there's an economist called Joseph Schumpeter who sort of coined this term called creative destruction. And that actually, in an economy, a free market economy, different things will change. People will make different decisions, and they'll innovate, and they'll develop, and businesses will fail because their resources and not enough people like what they do. And the more and more times that you actually get those kind of developments, the better creations that you actually end up seeing. There's also the element of the fact that a lot of these particular different crises, so thinking about 2008 or even indeed the Great Depression, a lot of that has to do with unprecedented levels of government intervention. So you're going to hear a little bit later, or the next speaker, about how governments and how different particularly permissive groups end up using the system and lobbying the government for special privileges in order to develop the economy and try and make capitalism work for them rather than anybody else. So one thing I would say with that last argument, you have to separate what the free market is, which is what we're talking about, and the system that we have today, which is one in which people are developing and using the monopoly of government, the power that government has, to make the system work predominantly for them. But I've just told you about these criticisms and I've sort of attached them head on, but I've not told you why the system is moral. A lot of people will end up saying, you know what, okay, I get it, I see these arguments, I think that capitalism is probably a better system than socialism, it's probably better than other systems, but it's still not great. And I'm here to tell you why that's totally wrong. Why capitalism is not only the better economic system for all of you, for all of our wealth, for all of our development, but actually why it is the only moral, just economic system. Have any of you ever been in love? Hands up. And that doesn't have to be a person. It could be a thing, it could be an activity, it could be a sport, it could be a movie. You absolutely love this movie. Hands up. Who's loved something? Could be your mum. We've all loved something. What does love do? What is love? What does it do to us as human beings? Who can tell me? Who can describe? Who's brave enough to describe love?
It changes our perspective on the world.
Yes, it changes your perspective on the world. It changes your perspective on life, on the things that you do in the world. It makes you stay up until the early hours of the morning thinking about a particular thing. Sometimes when I get really passionate about something, if I get really interested in something, I end up thinking about it all the time and it completely takes over my life. It completely takes over how I think about things. So love is crazy. Love drives us to do absolutely crazy things. You might stay up very, very early. You might try and do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. You might do something for your mother that you absolutely love that you wouldn't do for anybody else, because there is something innate inside of you as a human being, as somebody that loves, that makes you do those things, that drives you to do those things. Now, I want to look at love, and I want to think about it in the way in which literature has depicted it. So I am British, of course I'm going to use Shakespeare as an example. Love has been depicted throughout literature. This is Duke Orsino from Twelfth Night, which is my favourite Shakespearean play. And he said, "If music be the food of love, play on. Love makes you crazy. It drives you to do things that you otherwise would never do. It makes you behave in certain ways that you otherwise wouldn't deem normal or wouldn't deem sort of an absolute for other particular perspectives and other relationships." So love drives us to do certain things. Now, love, this passion, this drive, this hope, is the driving force behind entrepreneurship, behind business making, behind ideas. The passion, the love, the drive, the hope is exactly what drives people to do things and to create things. To be an entrepreneur, you have to be absolutely barking mad. You have to love what you do. It's not just about making money. It would be stupid if it was just about making money, because almost everyone fails. Data from the US Bureau of Labour Statistics, the BLS, shows that approximately 20% of new businesses fail during the first 2 years of being open, 45% during the first 5 years, and 65% during the first 10 years. So only 25% of new businesses make it to 15 years. So you're much more likely to fail than you are to succeed. But it's the love of an idea, something that doesn't yet exist, that you want to create in order to better everybody else. Now remember, as Doug has mentioned earlier, as a business owner and as an entrepreneur, in order to succeed as a business, you have to create something that other people also want, that other people are willing to give their money up in order to receive any kind of service or good or product or anything. In a free market economy, you have to consent to giving that kind of product, to to giving that kind of, or to exchange. All of that exchange is based on consent. It's based on that particular thing. Now, Ayn Rand, has anybody heard of Ayn Rand? She's pretty popular in the States. Here we go, yes, a couple of hands. So Ayn Rand was a philosopher. I quite like Ayn Rand. She's just very, very kind of controversial in many, many different spaces. I think she's pretty cool, and I think that her perspective on things like life and philosophy, but also entrepreneurship itself, is really, really fascinating. So Ayn Rand said, to love is to value. So to love is to value. What does that mean? If you love something, if you love love an idea, or if you love a product, or you love a particular perspective, that means you value it. You value it. Now, in a market, what that would mean is that you value something so much, you're willing to do things that otherwise you wouldn't do in order to achieve it. So, as I said, entrepreneurs are always more likely to fail than succeed. But people are willing to make so many sacrifices, their time, their money, their reputation, to create something new that other people will also want. And we've seen this time and time again throughout history. Here are three of, I think, the most prolific, most famous examples of entrepreneurs that I think encompass this very philosophy. This idea that as an entrepreneur, you're creating something that other people want, despite all of the hardship, despite the risks to your finances, to your reputation, to your time. These people are examples of people that have created something, innovated something, that have changed the world in such a significant way. So I think the most interesting example out of all three of these are Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the founders of Apple Computers. The two of them, of course, I mean, this is a very, very famous story. They started Apple Computers in their garage. What do you call a garage in the States?
Garage.
A garage. You do call it a garage. Okay, a garage. I thought it was something different. Anyway, a garage in Los Angeles, in California. It's very, very well known. And they, pulled out of college. So they were in college. They pulled out of college. They risked everything. They risked so much to develop these products. And they have been immensely successful. Something that I think is interesting that, I think it was Steve Jobs that said this, my advice to you, persevere when times are tough. Sometimes life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. And I think what's really interesting about that perspective is, despite all of the hardship and despite all of the different perceptions, that actually you could do something really terrible, or you could lose your entire finances, your reputation, your time, your money, everything. These are examples of people that have created things that other people want, and that have developed products that other people want, and they have significantly improved people's lives. Think about the fact that a person at the very, very bottom of the socioeconomic scale has the exact same phone technology product as the wealthiest billionaires in the world. They have the same phone. They have an iPhone, right? Most of them have iPhones. It's the exact same product. It's technology is one of the most incredible equalizers in all of society, and it's so fascinating to see that kind of development as well. But it's very important to note that the reason why this is moral is because in a free market economy, you are rewarded for creating something that other people also want. And this is one example of an economist that discussed this. So Israel Kerner was an Austrian economist. He was in the Austrian school, so over in Europe, not too far from where I am in the UK. And it's about creating that thing that somebody else wants, but also discovering those resources. So I would write down this name. He's very, very interesting. And if any of you end up studying economics or looking at the economy as a whole, he's definitely somebody that you would want to look up. He says that human action is discovery. The act of discovery in which resources are deployed to achieve an objective represents the realization that, before the discovery, the relevant resources had been undervalued. The full potential of these resources had, up until this point, not been understood, and the act of discovery, and thus indeed every single human action, represents the discovery of hitherto unsuspected value in hitherto undervalued resources. So what all of that language means, effectively, human action The act of human action is discovery, and entrepreneurs, what they do is they discover resources that up until that point had been undervalued, and they create value. And this goes back to Ayn Rand's "to love is to value." If you are an entrepreneur and you love something, it means that you value that particular thing. You value it in a marketplace to the point that you're willing to achieve so much, you're willing to sacrifice so much in order to create that particular product or service for other people. Howard Roark is a character in one of Ayn Rand's novels, The Fountainhead. And Howard Roark is kind of encompasses this kind of perspective that actually, as an entrepreneur, you need to be in a society in which you are allowed to be free. You need to be free in order to create, in order to innovate. The basic need of the creator is independence. The reasoning mind cannot work under any form of compulsion. It cannot be curbed, sacrificed, or subordinated to any consideration whatsoever. It demands total independence in function and in motive. In many ways, this is why, from a moral perspective, from a just perspective, the government compelling people to create something doesn't work. And actually, from a moral perspective, the freedom to exchange and the freedom to create, the freedom to be an entrepreneur is so, so important. And Howard Roark as a character, I think, if you've watched the movie's pretty good. I would read the book, but if you don't want to read the book, watch the movie, The Fountainhead. Howard Roark as a character encompasses that kind of philosophy. As an entrepreneur, you're creating something. So, to be very, very clear, this is the point, the primary point I'm trying to make here. The reason why capitalism is moral is not because it gives us great consequences. We've seen across the world, as I said earlier, that capitalism and the free market, free exchange, creates all of these really, really wonderful consequences. It means that we're able to put food on the table and have clothes. It means that we're able to see all of these technological advancements. It creates all of these really, really wonderful things. But the reason why the free market is moral is not just, it's a good system, it's not that great, but it's good. The reason why it's a good system, the reason why it's a moral system, is because it is based on voluntary exchange. So voluntary exchange is a transaction where goods or services are traded freely. So there is no coercive or restrictive force involved in the transaction. So something like a government, a monopoly on force, has absolutely no interference whatsoever. Both parties want to make the exchange, and both parties benefit from the trade. So voluntary exchange is the basis of a free market economy. So when I'm talking about the free market, when I'm talking about capitalism in these terms, I'm talking about it on this basis, that it is based on the idea that voluntary exchange is based on consent. It's individuals or two people choosing to create something and choosing to exchange it freely with one another. This is why capitalism, the free market, is a moral system. It is morally right. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't agree with me, and it makes me very sad. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of socialism, which we touched on a little bit earlier, is the idea that actually a political and economic theory of social organisation that advocates that the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned and regulated by the community as a whole. Now, by community as a whole, it usually means some form of government, some form of coercive authority. And under socialism, the entrepreneur, the Steve Wozniaks of the world, are not rewarded for their love. They're not rewarded for their value. As Israel Kerner described it, this discovery of resources, they're not rewarded for it. They're not even incentivized to do it in the first place. And that's why you see this lack of entrepreneurship, this lack of innovation in countries that have a command economy. So in countries that are socialist, in countries that have a central government authority that plans things and plans the economy, the primary reason why you don't get the Elon Musks or the Steve Wozniaks or the Steve Jobs of the world in those countries is because of this very reason. They're not rewarded for it, they're not incentivized to do it, and in some cases, very extreme cases, they're actually killed for it. So in the Soviet Union, if you are a kulak or a very, very well-off peasant who is creating a surplus of grain or of their produce, and you are found to have been doing that, you are creating more product for other people, you would be killed. People literally burnt down their livestock in the Soviet Union in order to not be seen as a capitalist. So that's a very extreme example, but this all comes back to the very, very basic notion that actually under a free market economy, it is moral because you see voluntary exchange, and it is absolutely necessary that entrepreneurs are able to freely exchange with one another, and entrepreneurs are able to freely create and innovate in order for us to see the advancements that we have today. Now, I don't know if this is going to play. I'm going to try.
The basic principles underlying the free market, as Adam Smith taught them to his students in this university, are really very simple. Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was the magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
Amazing. So, nobody in the world can make a pencil, and the only way that pencils are created, or indeed many other products are ever created, is because of the magic of the price system. Let's see if this will come back to us. The magic of technology, also created by the free market. Okay. Unfortunately, most people don't agree with us. Let's see if I can make this back on the screen. There we go. Oh. Okay, that doesn't matter. You can still see it. We're losing the intellectual battle amongst young people. You guys are young. I also consider myself still a bit young. The majority of people in the 18 to 34-year-old age bracket believe that socialism is the ideal economic system. Oh, it's crazy. Why? How? Where are they hearing these ideas? Usually social media. This is polling that was done by the Fraser Institute, that was commissioned by the Fraser Institute. It was done by Lega, which is a polling company. And in the United States, 32% 32% agree. In the United Kingdom, it's even worse. It's 40%. It's really bad over there. Young people have completely lost these key principles. They've lost the belief in these principles. That free exchange, the free market, is what makes us wealthier, but also that it is the most moral and just economic system. And that is why it is so incredibly important that all of you in this room are engaging with these ideas. The fact that you even signed up to the Leadership Academy and that you showed up here today is proof that you are engaging in these ideas. So very, very well done to all of you. But also the fact that actually all of these ideas are being so stamped out online and so stamped out by these particularly pervasive ideas, in my view. Let me see if I can actually make this full present. There we go. This is now full screen. Social media communists. Hands up if you're on TikTok. Ah, yes, you're all on TikTok. I am also on TikTok. I spend a lot of time scrolling on TikTok. Too much time. Very bad. But online, on social media like TikTok, Instagram, on X, on things like that, you hear these perspectives so often, all the time. Hands up if you've heard a pro-communist video on TikTok. There you go. Look at that. It's mental. And in the comments, all that you see is those particular perspectives saying, yes, this is terrible, we've got to eat the rich, we've got to bring down capitalism. These people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, and they also, I think, do not understand the rather dangerous nature of what they are saying. This idea, I mean, this one, he was like, things I do on my commune, on my lovely commune. If this was an actual commune, you'd probably be dead, you'd probably be starving in the famine. And if this was an actual Soviet commune, you'd probably not be allowed to, well, you wouldn't have a phone to even post on TikTok in the first place. So I think we've got to be very, very clear and understand these perspectives, use your brains, use critical thinking skills, and when you see these kind of perspectives online, you can fight against them and you can argue against them, and also you can understand where they are coming from. All of you today have heard these arguments, you've heard them from me and you'll hear various different arguments during the rest of today, that actually these particular perspectives are actually incredibly dangerous. And the fact that so many of you have seen them online as well is just proof of that concept. So it's important that all of you, no matter what you do, join this fight for freedom. This country is great because it allows for freedom and allows for prosperity. Protect it. Fight with it. Fight with it with your life. Demand it. Ensure that you are protecting it. And ensure that you are allowing these kind of perspectives, these very, very pervasive, incredibly authoritarian, dictatorial perspectives, and take them away from that. I'm originally North African. I'm half Egyptian and half Moroccan. And so Egypt is a good example of that. It used to be so incredibly prosperous, and it was, in the sort of 20s and even the early 30s, was so incredibly successful, especially after, I suppose, official independence from empire. And yet, at the same time, today, Egypt is incredibly poor. There are millions of people that are in poverty, and so much of that is as a result of the government's nationalisation programmes, the government taking over control of different things, the government unprecedentedly intervening in the economy. And so Egypt today is incredibly poor. There are the exact reasons why a country like Singapore, for example, has become so prosperous it is wealthier than the coloniser. So Singapore was colonised by Great Britain and is now wealthier than its coloniser. So colonisation didn't make those countries poor, it was what they did afterwards. Singapore is, I think, an excellent example of that, where they've become so incredibly wealthy and so successful because they've opened up to freer trade economically. Does anybody have any questions? We've got a bit of time, I think. About 15 minutes. Questions, discussions, or thoughts or opinions? Yes.
Okay, the healthcare question
Yeah.
is a big one I've been thinking about. The United States, we obviously don't have free healthcare for most people. Why do more Norwegian countries and Icelandic countries have that but still have free trade? How can they have both of those?
A lot of them don't. So this is actually a really, really interesting discussion. In the UK, we have something called the National Health Service. It's the NHS. Now, you said free. What you mean by free is free at the point of use.
You pay taxes. You pay extra taxes.
So you're paying for it through taxation. Now, it's really important that we think about these as incentives. So in the UK, we've got something called the NHS, National Health Service. It is absolutely abysmal. So from this perspective, yes, it's free at the point of use. It's founded on these principles. It's free at the point of use, so when you walk in, you don't pay anything. And it's universal access for all. But are those things really true? In the UK at the moment, we have waiting lists above 8 million. It's absurd. It's impossible to get any kind of healthcare in the UK. It's literally so terrible. So many people go private because they just can't access it. People that are not wealthy save huge amounts of money to try and get access to healthcare because they just can't, because the system is so terrible. And we currently have the highest tax burden since the Second World War. So is it really free at the point of use? I mean, it's free at the point of use, but is it really free? Does it feel free? Paying huge amounts of money in tax. You've mentioned Norwegian countries. Countries like Sweden have public and private partnerships, so they have competition between healthcare sectors. Sweden does not have. The UK has one of the most socialist healthcare systems, and it is absolutely terrible. It is horrendous. People can't access healthcare. My dad has something called keratosis, which means that he had to have surgery, routine kind of surgery in his eye. He had to wait 6 months for an appointment. On the day of the appointment, they cancelled it. And then he was like, okay, let's try and figure out other alternatives. Ended up finding a private doctor in Spain that would do it that week. And it wasn't that expensive. Yes, Douglas.
I was just going to say, if you attempted to emulate the British model of healthcare, which is free, I would just warn you, when I lived in Britain, my dog got better medical treatment than my daughter. I'm not kidding. When my daughter was ill, I couldn't get an appointment with the doctor for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The vet, who I paid $500 to every year, would come around and treat the sick dog because I was paying them $500. In other words, because it's free in Britain, you don't get any healthcare, or you have to stand in line for healthcare and you don't get it when you want it, but you have no power as a consumer. It's like being in the Soviet Union. You have to stand in line and hope that there's bread in the shops that day. It's a terrible system.
And it's really important to understand why. Why is it that in a sort of more socialist system where it's universal for all, you end up having these shortages, you end up having providers not able to do anything, you end up having patients not able to receive healthcare, and yet in systems that allow for competition, you see more success. Why is that? Why is there that difference? Yes?
Because, well, there's a lot more doctors, first of all, because they get paid tons of money. And then, drug manufacturers get paid a lot of money for their drugs. And so it's healthy profits for them, so it's
Absolutely.
incentivized.
It's incentives. So the two key elements to a market economy are choice for consumers and competition between providers. So in a healthcare system, like, for example, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, these are European systems. This is something at the IEA we actually came up with a paper with recently, talking about these systems in Europe and why we should get rid of universal healthcare, because it's not universal. Competition between providers. So if you're a healthcare provider, you're a healthcare company, you're going to want, as I said in my talk earlier, you're a business, you're going to want to create something that other people want. And so you're competing with other providers. You've got competition between those providers. So you're going to want to make the system better. You're going to want to make sure that your service is better, that people choose your service over other people's service. That's what competition does. And then as a consumer, you have choice. If I don't like this doctor, I go to this doctor. If I don't like this healthcare provider, I go to that healthcare provider. And then there's reputation, they have reviews, you can develop a full market in healthcare. So the difference between a monopoly in healthcare, as Douglas described in the NHS, and in a market economy is competition between providers and choice for patients. And fundamentally, it's about giving power back to patients, ensuring that consumers in that economy have the power to make their own choices about their own healthcare. Yes?
The problem, too, with taxes is Reagan said one time, he was talking about social programs. A lot of the money that's dedicated to social programs gets lost in translation. So it's a big problem in African countries. A lot of governments will have a lot of corruption, And so when the tax is so high, a lot of it actually isn't getting put to work. It's just getting lost in corruption.
Yeah, a lot of it is bureaucracy as well, right? The NHS has, I always forget the stat now, it's like only a fifth of the employees in the NHS are actually clinicians. A lot of them are like middle managers, like literally just job creation, because it's a monopoly, right? So it's a state-run monopoly. Socialism allows for state-run monopolies. So there's no competition. There's no one saying, well, actually, you're going to lose business if you don't improve and become more efficient. What's happening instead is they are actually incentivized to basically provide a really, really poor service, or in many cases across the country, no service at all. And instead, you end up having this system in which people are not able to receive healthcare. Healthcare standards in the UK, just to be clear, this is a socialist monopoly healthcare system. People like Bernie Sanders in the US keep saying that, look at countries like the NHS and, look at the NHS, it's great. The UK has the highest, the second highest avoidable mortality rate in all of Western Europe. So we actually are killing people as a result of this terrible, terrible healthcare system. So don't let anybody tell you that universal healthcare is great. It sounds great. It was founded on these principles, universal healthcare and free access at the point of use. But we have so many very, very high levels of mortality rates, preventable mortality rates. And in my view, if we were to fix the system, ensure that we have a market economy in healthcare, actually what we end up having is a much better system where people are able to use those advancements for themselves, but also crucially from this talk, that is moral. People have choice and they are able to make those choices, and it's not some central commissar or government that are making those choices for them. Any other thoughts or views? I think we've got a bit more time. Yes, we've got 10 minutes. Any other opinions, thoughts, questions? Does anybody disagree with me or agree with me or say something that I said something wrong or right?
I think the socialism rise in the UK could be attributed to Jeremy Corbyn too.
Yes.
So he's our equivalent to Bernie.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people, young people, are kind of fed up with the system. Not that I necessarily agree with them, but they want something different, and so they see these extreme beliefs and they just attach themselves to them. Because I watched a debate with Jeremy Corbyn, and he was defending the concept of socialism in the Oxford Union, and so it's
It's terrible. I've got to say, I'm going to admit something. I loved Jeremy Corbyn when I was 16. I loved him. I was 16. I went to a state school, government-run school in London, and my mum grew up in social housing. And there's always a Labour voter, and I saw Jeremy Corbyn saying, "Woo, pro-Palestine," and I just thought, oh my God, he's amazing. I'm a socialist. And then I started studying economics and realised all this stuff.
Well, you have that on a parliamentarian level, but King Charles III, he's pretty much lean socialist too. He's one to implement all these things that are the universal health care. So it's kind of hard to thrive under that when you have your head of state and your parliament kind of thinking that same way.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I actually think this goes back to your point that it's, if people feel like the system isn't working for them, then they end up going to, believing in more radical positions. And you're going to hear about this in the next talk. Why is it that the current system, what differs from the current system to what we're talking about when we're talking about a free market? Right, you've got. I don't want to preempt your next speaker, but effectively, you have governments intervening in the system, and which effectively means it doesn't work for them. So, in the UK, we have one of the most horrendous housing crises ever, because the government and many of them, conservative-run governments, have restricted the housing supply, which means that young people don't get on the housing ladder, which means that they don't feel like they have a stake in society. We're talking about capitalists. They don't become a capitalist because they don't own any capital. And then they end up believing, actually, the system is so broken, I want socialism. Of course, no idea that actually they didn't grow up during the 80s and 90s and hearing about the horrendous atrocities that occurred in the Soviet Union, so they don't understand what socialism really is or what it does. But they end up believing this. And so I think it's really important, and you're going to hear about this in the next talk, to separate what we're talking about voluntary exchange and the current system we have in which the government intervenes in those exchanges, regulates it, it requires you to have a license. You see so many times in digital market spaces, a lot of large businesses lobby the government for more regulation. Because if you're a big business, you can absorb those regulatory costs really easily. You know, you're probably already doing a lot of those things. If you're a small business, a new app startup, or a smaller business entering the market, it's much more difficult for you to enter the market because you have to comply with all of those regulatory costs. Yes, you said you were going to make a good point.
What's your solution to that? To like people wanting socialism?
To people wanting socialism, I think the solution to all of this is a smaller state, a limited government, things that the Mississippi Centre for Public Policy argue for. What we need is a smaller state because we can see what they're actually doing, we have more transparency. But also, from a moral perspective, what is right, what is a morally right thing, is that we allow for voluntary exchange. That we allow for people to make exchanges that are not compelled by some commissar in the government or some bureaucrat, but are allowed to happen because they themselves want it to happen.
If I could just go back to
Yeah, of
housing.
course.
So like Vice President Harris is campaigning on giving first-time home buyers like a $25,000 home loan. And so studies by Bloomberg have shown that in areas where a fourth of home buyers receive that $25,000, home prices are expected to go up by 5%. So it's kind of like what Mr. Douglas was talking about unintended consequences. When Nikki Haley was governor of South Carolina, they passed a state lottery, and so they basically used the money from the lottery to give college students $3,500 to help pay for tuition, and then colleges just raised tuition by $3,500 to offset this cost. And so it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier about unintended consequences.
You're absolutely right. So many times, politicians and governments will tell you that they have a solution to something, and there are so many horrible consequences as a result. I think housing is a really good example of that. Now, it's economics 101. If you increase the supply of something, the market price will usually come down. If demand stays the same, then if you increase supply, then prices will come down. So to solve the housing crisis, to make housing more accessible to younger people, which is something that I'm really passionate about, we have to build more houses. We have to ensure that businesses and infrastructure projects are allowed to actually happen in the first place. And just the UK as an example of that, we don't do any of that. We don't build anything. And if we're hearing these particular arguments, it might sound really nice, right, as a young person. Kamala's given me a house. But what are the unintended consequences of that? What does that mean for everywhere else in the economy? Yes?
The problem too is like, there's like big companies buying up like a lot of houses, I think, in the United States, like BlackRock.
BlackRock is one of the main.
Well, so I'm not familiar with the BlackRock case itself, but that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, right? If large businesses are buying up houses, that wouldn't be a problem if they're allowed to compete with other homeowners or other big company owners, right?
I'm not sure if they're rinsing them out though. I think they're just like letting. It's kind of like making like a monopoly, and it's like they're like increasing housing supply or like housing prices, and people can't buy their own house, so there's no competition because they just buy the houses.
A lot of the time, monopolies are created, as I said earlier, with regulation. A lot of the time, monopolies are created as a result of government regulation, as a result of governments intervening. And actually, there's one economist that said this: we shouldn't be afraid of monopolies if a monopoly exists because the majority of people love their product and love that company. We shouldn't be afraid of monopolies. Monopolies can be good if they're created under a system of voluntary exchange. But a lot of the time, that isn't the case at the moment, and effectively, monopolies are often created as a result of governments intervening in this way. And you're going to hear so much more about this in the next talk with the current system and how governments and the market intervene itself. But just as a final point, before I end up shutting up, all of you, no matter what you do, if you end up working in policy or you end up working as a nurse or a doctor or a teacher or whatever it is your responsibility to fight for the prosperity that this country has so graciously received as a result of the system of voluntary exchange. You, no matter what you do, no matter where you are, no matter what you end up doing, the fact that you're here today is so important because it means you're hearing these ideas and you're now equipped with the arguments to make them everywhere you go. So stand up for the freedom that this country so amazingly has been able to protect it, receive it, and ensure that it doesn't end up getting abolished or restricted in your lifetime. Fight for freedom. Thank you.